Welcome to Asia in Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Today, my guest is Jacques DeLisle. He is a professor of Chinese law and Chinese politics at the University of Pennsylvania. He did his undergraduate work at Princeton University, then went on to Harvard Law School, where he received a JD. Clerking, as a law clerk, he clerked for Justice, then not quite Justice at that time, but Stephen Breyer. He also has a very good relationship with well-known Jerome Cohen. We welcome him to Asian Review, and might note that he's also a very, very good writer, very analytical, and very incisive. Welcome to Asian Review.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're really glad to have him with us today. In just a few hours, he's going to get back on a plane for Philadelphia. So our timing is just really on the money here today. Oh, wow, so much to talk about. And of course, the big story in Chinese politics is the Gu Kailai case.
Yes.
And for the benefit of our audience, I wonder if you could just give a brief summary of the situation that led to her trial and give us your take on the verdict.
Well, it's a complex and tawdry tale. We could probably go through a lot of our time just recounting it. Gu Kailai is the wife of Bo Xilai. And Bo Xilai is a fairly major figure in Chinese politics. His father was one of that founding revolutionary generation, essentially almost one of Mao's peers. No one was Mao's peer, but
no one was Mao's peer,
yes.
Absolutely.
But that generation of leaders, his name was Bo Yibo, and was one of the so-called eight immortals of that founding generation. And as with many leaders from that generation, he came under fire. During the more tumultuous part of the Mao years, earlier than the Cultural Revolution, but still in a stretch where you would have seen some. He survived quite well, on the whole. But again, so what you had was the children of that generation, including Bo Xilai.
The princelings.
This are often called the princelings, yes. And so that group, including very much Bo Xilai himself, were on a fast track, or at least on a reliable track, towards senior leadership positions. And Bo, on the whole, had had a quite remarkable career. He had been the mayor of Dalian, a city up in Liaoning province in northeast China, where he was really quite highly respected for the economic progress and the cleanliness of the city. It had been physically cleaned up, and it really was one of the great success stories among the coastal cities of China, particularly in the northeast, which is kind of like China's Ohio or western Pennsylvania, kind of a rust belt. So he was quite well known for that. Ran into a few political troubles, but eventually landed the job as Minister of Commerce, which was this new mega ministry set up to run much of the economy and the foreign trade and investment relationship. And then his next posting was party secretary in Chongqing, which he was until earlier this spring. And he there ran a very, very tough system. I mean, it was very controversial. He was known for the campaign to hit black and sing red, basically striking against organized crime, a real law and order type, but also dusting off a lot of almost Cultural Revolution Mao-era nostalgia, a kind of neo-leftism, if you will. And Chongqing did pretty well economically. It started to draw foreign investments in larger quantities and was a success story, again, among the inland cities. We're used to thinking of the Chinese success stories as being Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou down the coast, but he had presided over two of the somewhat tougher cases of great economic success. The problem with it was twofold, really. One, that there's a controversy about how much of the economic gains were due to good policy and his good works and how much were due to general policies, state funds, and perhaps even expropriating a few entrepreneurs, some of whom hightailed it out of Chongqing. And he certainly ruled it very toughly. And he brought his police chief with him from Dalian. This is Wang Lijun, who we'll talk about in a moment, who wound up...
Who's also a very interesting figure in his own right.
Very much part of the story. So what you have is he's very, very tough, not only on the mafia, but tough on anybody who perceives to be an enemy. And he's a populist. And there's just even almost a whiff of fascism to it all. Both the strongman leadership, the populism, the attempt to provide better economic resources to less well-off through public housing and that sort of thing. So he's a very controversial figure, in some ways praised for economic success, in some ways praised for his populism, and in some ways criticized for his really very, very tough and indeed ruthless tactics, as well as charges of corruption, which are nearly ubiquitous about
every Chinese leader has those, don't they?
Right, and Bo is certainly among those accused of corruption at various times in his career. There's some hints of it back in Dalian, but certainly in Chongqing. the sense that a lot of money was flowing in. Now, of course, the way corruption works in China, you often have the money going not to the official himself, but those around him get rich, often through business dealings.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point.
And so the Bo family fortune became quite substantial, but much of the money seemed to flow to relatives, including his wife, Gu Kailai, which is where we get into the story. So Gu Kailai is his wife. She's a lawyer.
And her father was a very prominent figure in the founding of the People's Republic of China as well.
Right, so she's very much also a child of the founding generation of revolutionaries. This is a very elite marriage. They have a son, Bo Guagua, who lives a very nice life as well. They send him abroad for preparatory school in Britain, and he winds up in the master's program at Harvard at the Kennedy School. So somebody who's very much on his own elite track. And again, lots of money sloshing around. So what happens is really a couple of things that lead to Gu Kailai's undoing and Bo Xilai's undoing as well. That is that Bo has been angling for a top position on the Politburo Standing Committee, and preferably fairly high on the Politburo Standing Committee. At one time, he had dreams surely of being Hu Jintao's successor, in effect, which is obviously going to go to Xi Jinping. So he was jockeying for that position, and what he did that was inexcusable is he campaigned outside the relatively closed channels. He campaigned to the broader elite. He made a sort of a PR machine for himself with the broader public.
That's a good point.
And this was an attempt to do an end run around what is very much a top-down managed system to land himself higher. That's something of a double or nothing bet, and it's one that you can easily lose on. So there was a lot of pushback against him for that. So that's one piece of what happened, and then he would monitor the communications of people coming through Chongqing, including apparently Hu Jintao, the top leader, which is a serious breach of party discipline.
So where does his wife get into all this trouble now?
Well, two things. One is that well, actually, it's probably just one thing. That is, the business dealings heavily involved her. They wouldn't involve Bo directly. It would involve people who had access to him. To the extent we're talking about possible corruption. And Gu Kailai had a quite formidable little empire going, and a bunch of dealings, including some real estate dealings, including one that involved Neil Heywood, or several that involved Neil Heywood.
Who was the British subject.
Right, he was a British national married to a Chinese wife, who, by the accounts we have anyway, was involved in some rather large-scale real estate dealings involving the Bo family as well. The deals fell through in a variety of ways, and the story that has come out, the story that was told at the trial by and large, is that Neil Heywood threatened Bo Guagua, the son.
Do you believe that? I mean, admittedly, the information is still kind of coming out, but...
It's entirely plausible. I mean, we don't know that much about Neil Heywood. Surely someone does, but it's so shrouded now in myth and mystery that it's hard to say. There certainly is a lot of hard knuckles dealing. Now, it'd be a pretty nervy thing to do, given Bo Xilai's reputation for toughness. I don't think, we may never know whether there actually was a threat. There was a story even that Bo Guagua was physically forcibly detained in Britain, which is more plausible in Britain by Heywood. And it's certainly possible that he was either panicking or thought that this was a way of salvaging some profit out of the deal.
How do you read Heywood? I mean, to me, he seems like a little bit of a, well, as the British would say, dodgy character.
Well, that does seem to be the case. I mean, these are high stakes, high risk, high return property ventures. When the way property works in China, certainly it's deeply entangled with the government for expropriation of property for development into higher uses. And if you're dealing with very senior officials in this way, a significant number of those dealings are likely at least to have some taint. Surely some of them are straight up, but many of them are not. So there is a wheeler-dealer quality and a certain willingness to skirt the edge. And whatever his particular threats against Bo Guagua, and again, there hasn't been a whole lot of dispute that there was a significant falling out and some kind of controversy between them. He clearly wound up crossing Gu Kailai and Bo Xilai, that family, quite seriously. So, at least the information we have from the trial, and this is what Gu Kailai was tried for, is Neil Heywood turns up dead in a villa at a hotel near Chongqing. And the story we have is that he was lured there by people in the Gu Kailai Bo Xilai circle, and gotten drunk, and that he was poisoned, with Gu Kailai playing the central role in this poisoning of Heywood.
Some suggest the one who actually administered the poison.
That's again appears to be the story that we've gotten out of the rather rather brief trial and investigation. So what we see happening earlier this spring is the whole story starting to unravel. So it was all this background stuff, all this background issue with Bo's political maneuverings and attempts to launch himself into a higher position through means that clearly upset a lot of people. The substance of his message, this so-called Chongqing model, which is this large state role, this populist, somewhat redistributionist tone, and this kind of real lack of regard for the rule of law and a tough law and order type approach. That package of ideas, the so-called Chongqing model, was was on one side of some policy debates that people didn't like. So there was the method of what he was doing, there was the personal ambition, and there was the package of ideas that he stood for, and then there were these issues of corruption and brutality.
Well, I want to ask you a couple questions directly about the trial, but first of all, I want to see what you think about this. I've read some accounts that say, well, yeah, as you suggested, he was mayor of Dalian. He did a really good job. They brought him to Beijing, head of the Ministry of Commerce. And he seems to have done a good job there, but he seems to have been gotten on a lot of people's nerves, and they wanted to get rid of him, so they packed him off to Chongqing.
Well, some of it's packing. He's been a controversial figure for a long time, often lionized, and indeed up to very near the end, he was lionized by people who were attracted by the Chongqing model and who saw him as a sort of representative or a spokesman or even sort of prominent leader for this more populist redistributionist thing. And remember that one of the hot social issues in China is profound social economic inequality.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
People are getting left behind, are getting left ever farther behind, the rich are getting richer. And so to speak to those concerns, to say we must look out for the poor, that was something that's been part of the Hu Jintao Wenjiabao package, but Bo was in some ways taking that a step further.
People I've talked to in China that have become very wealthy will also say that this disparity in wealth is a huge problem, and they themselves are worried about it. Yeah. Okay, the trial itself. Right. Now, here's where the law professor really comes in. What's your take on it?
Well, just one last piece before we get there, which was the last bit of the unraveling. What led to Gu Kailai's arrest and to Bo Xilai's removal from office, he's in detention now, was Wang Lijun, that police chief who was Bo's henchman, as it were, in Dalian, and then followed him to Chongqing. He was drawn into the plot to kill Haywood, and ultimately balked at the idea, we were told, and had a falling out with Bo and Gu, and went to the U.S. consulate in Chengdu.
I wanted to ask you some questions about him, but I was going to hold off. But as long as we're talking about Wang Lijun, you want to talk about the trial and go back to him?
I'll go back to him. So Wang Lijun goes to the U.S. consulate in Chengdu, which is not too far from Chongqing. Chongqing used to be part of Sichuan province, where Chengdu is, and spills the beans, basically. He's then, the deal he apparently strikes is to get turned over to the central authorities in Beijing, because we sent back to Chongqing, things are going to be very, very ugly for him. They're going to be ugly for him anyway.
Apparently, Bo Xilai sent some other police officers after him.
That's the story.
And, probably lucky for him, they didn't get a hold of him.
Right. Again, it's going to be very hard to unpack for quite some time which of the details are true, which is semi-mythical, but the basic outlines, I think, are pretty clear, which is that Wang Lijun had good reason to fear for his safety and life.
And now he's being charged with treason. I don't know. That seems to be a stretch for me. But, I mean, Chinese law can define anything, can it? Well, Chinese politics can come up with all kinds of definitions of situationally based.
Right. Well, I mean, and a sitting official going to a foreign consulate is a tough thing to be doing, and we don't know exactly what he delivered there, but if he was by many accounts offering some things that would be considered quite problematic from the Chinese regime's perspective. And remember that China has an extremely broad state secrets notion.
Everything's a state secret.
Right. So dissidents, it's usually been used against dissidents who have somehow gotten hold of some information and released it to the foreign media. You can face charges of divulging state secrets, even for people who have no particular access. For somebody with the kind of access that Wang Lijun, somebody of that level would have, he certainly has access to information that would absolutely be regarded as state secrets.
And he was a pretty high profile himself, a person in his own right, wasn't he? He was sort of a model for a TV show, and I mean, he was pretty well known, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, he was not a name out of nowhere when the story hit. But you wanted to get to the Gu Kailai trial before we...
the Gu Kailai trial. Now, did the verdict surprise you?
No.
I don't think it surprises anybody.
No, I mean,
that follows Chinese politics anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it was going to be a guilty verdict. I mean, the evidence was probably quite good by any measure, but you don't proceed forward with a trial like this unless you know you've got the goods, and Chinese courts are not going to fail to convict in a highly politicized case like this once it comes to trial.
The fact that it was held in Anhui province, what was your take on that? Which is somewhat distant from Chongqing.
Yeah, I mean, it's away from Chongqing. I think that means nothing more than they didn't want an incident. They didn't want to help make Gu Kailai and by implication Bo Xilai martyrs. They didn't want people who were supporters of Bo showing up and disrupting the proceedings or creating some sort of media circus. So they moved it to a place where he didn't have that kind of following. He never really spent time in that part of the country. And they even so that there were reports of a couple of people showing up to make public gestures in support of Bo. I mean, for those who really read the criminological tea leaves in Chinese politics, they would say that Hu Jintao and others have roots and ties to Anhui, so it's a particularly safe place. But I think it was mostly just to get it out of Chongqing.
I've also heard that the Chief Justice of the Chinese Supreme Court is from Anhui.
Yes, yeah.
And he knew all the right people to have in place for this trial. I mean, that's one theory anyway.
Yeah, and Wang Shengjun is certainly somebody who has, shall we say, a taste for the politics within the judicial. I mean, for people who watch Chinese law, it's been a sad turn of events to see Wang Shengjun replace Xiaoyang as the president of the Supreme People's Court. Xiaoyang had been much more pro-rule of law, pro-independence of the judiciary, pro-separation of law and politics. Wang Shengjun has gone very much down another path. He's best known for something called the Three Supremes, which is the idea that courts should look not just at the law, but also at party policy and public opinion.
Oh, that's a very interesting point. Well, now, the Gu Kailai case, a couple other points that were made in Wall Street Journal, New York Times, various publications. I'm kind of interested to hear what your take on it is. Okay, when she appeared in the court, one theory goes, she was wearing this black kind of businesswoman suit. And some people are speculating, well, she's receiving special treatment because she isn't wearing an orange prison suit. And this reflects her party connections and reflects on who her father was. You see anything to that? That's reading the tea leaves, I suppose, but...
I think, did she get special treatment? Well, in some sense, yeah, she wasn't, subject to the kind of prison conditions that your average Chinese detainee is going to face. There was not an effort to humiliate her quite at that level. I mean, there was a time when somebody who fell partly for political reasons, often having done something else too. But when somebody fell partly for political reasons, the idea would be to humiliate them as much as possible. Think of the Cultural Revolution, Red Guard student trials. There was no attempt to do anything like that, or to even treat her necessarily as some common prisoners would be treated. But let's take a step back from this. She wound up with not the lawyer of her choice, giving the typically meek, shall we say, defense, which was not even a real challenge to the merits of the case. And she was convicted, as pretty much everyone thought she would be, and received a quite serious sentence, a death sentence, suspended for 2 years.
Could you explain that? Because I think a lot of our viewers, we have a very savvy audience, but they might not quite understand exactly what that means. Death sentence, suspended for 2 years.
Right. Well, the first thing to be said is that China has a lot of capital crimes. They brought the number down. It used to be something around 60. It's come down some. But much of that is consolidating under one heading what were previously separate crimes. So there are a lot of ways you can be sentenced to death in China, not just for killing people, but also for embezzlement of a certain levels.
Counterfeiting?
State funds. There are a long list of things. Drug crimes, but there are a bunch of capital crimes. And China, at this point, still has a world 50% plus share of judicially sanctioned execution. So there's a lot of that goes on. And certainly the kinds of things she did, a premeditated murder, is the kind of thing that easily, under the Chinese system, would get you a death sentence. Death sentence suspended for 2 years almost always means a life imprisonment.
Without the possibility of parole?
Yeah, what will happen is that the death sentence suspended for 2 years will often formally be changed to a life sentence, in effect. And then whether people get out or not, it's not really a parole system. People are released for a variety of reason. So if you think again of some of the political dissidents who were sentenced to very long terms, they were often released but into exile. I suspect we're probably, who knows, because it's a very politically charged case. One hesitates to predict where Chinese politics will be decades from now, and her life expectancy is a good 20, 30 years or more. So I would hesitate to say there's no way she would be released over that period, because things may change. But for now, I think it's an indefinite and potentially for the rest of her year's confinement. I mean, Jiang Qing died in prison after all.
Does this suggest hard labor or working on a prison farm or that kind of thing?
No, it suggests imprisonment. It's not. She's not going to be out, breaking rocks.
I didn't realize that. Did I hear you right? That China has no parole system, no system of parole.
There's not a formal parole system. You don't come up for parole hearings or things like that.
Okay. So what else does this say to you about the Chinese legal system, the Chinese court system? I mean, I don't think there were any surprises in it for you.
No. It was very much what you'd expect in a few ways. One is, again, because it's such a politically charged trial.
Where the party really is controlling everything.
In a case like this, how much is actual sitting down and saying you will do this, you will do that, and how much of it is understood, one can unpack. But nothing is going to be left to chance.
Right.
And so especially in a highly political case like this, there's no way it would have gone forward to prosecution and trial unless there was certainty that it would come out this way. 7-hour trial, not particularly short. Chinese criminal trials tend to be very quick. There's not witness testimony, live witness testimony very often. There can be, but a lot of it is done on the documents.
Yeah, I don't know. I've been aware of that for quite a long time, but it always strikes me as a bit odd.
Yeah. Well, the official and benevolent reading of it is that this is not a fully adversarial system. There have been reforms moving in that direction, but that it still retains a significant component of an inquisitorial system, such that the court and the prosecutor, and in China the prosecutor is called the procurator. These are Soviet inherited
Soviet
institutions,
terms, yeah.
And so the idea is that the state, in the form of the prosecutor and the court, undertake their own investigations, and so the trial is kind of the end of a long process. So in theory, the procurator, which is both prosecutor and overseer, kind of ombudsman, is not going to go forward with a case that doesn't merit this kind of treatment, and in theory the court can undertake a lot of investigation on its own. Now in practice, there's a lot of collaboration. A case like this, again, is not in doubt. But in criminal cases in general, one-day trial is often as much as you get. Appeals are virtually useless, virtually ineffective. Conviction rate is extremely high in the court of first instance. Yeah.
I mean, there were a few years ago there was some discussion in the Beijing Review, and of course that might not be the most unbiased publication that there is, but they were talking about the possibility of the Chinese court system introducing a form of jury. Yeah, but that doesn't seem to go anywhere as far as I know.
I mean, the idea surfaces periodically in the whole post-Soviet wave of reforms. There's been a lot of discussion in these socialist systems, these continental systems of introducing jury systems. Remember, jury isn't that common in the civil law system traditionally.
In Western Europe or
yeah, I mean, it's
leading democracies. Yeah.
Right. I mean, so we've seen a general rise in the use of juries against the baselines of sort of the Cold War era, certainly, as countries have begun experimenting with it and adopting it. I don't think you're going to see it happen in China real soon. What you do have is this system of so-called lay assessors, which this is again a kind of a Maoist idea, that you would have a judge sit alongside two lay people to try cases, and this was the dominant system for quite some time. And the idea was that they would bring the wisdom of the masses, do some of what jurors are supposed to do in a sense.
Yeah, right.
But by and large, except in the most radical times, the assessors more or less followed the judge's lead. And in the professionalization reforms that came in as the reform era got past its initial years, shifted away from that system toward a preference for judges, and so you went with single judge trials and multiple judge trials.
This is sort of a pattern in other parts of Asia, though. I mean, the Japanese have talked about a jury system, and I think it's implemented to some degree. Right. And I believe the Koreans have talked about it, and I've heard periodic discussion coming out of Taiwan about it. So it's in a way, China is to some degree in sync with these other Asian countries.
Sure, and there's obviously a lot of appeal to the jury system for the same reasons that it has some popularity in the U.S. It's a somewhat democratic institution. It's a kind of common sense, common wisdom institution. It takes the decisions out of the hands of narrow elites, and the sort of plausibility to it. And I think you've seen that wave come into East Asia with democratization. It's been sort of a follow-on to that. You've seen some of that in some of the post-Soviet areas. I think it's a tougher sell in China because you still do have this politicized compared to its neighbors and institutions. It doesn't, the notion of democracy, the officially acceptable notion of democracy remains rather different from ours. And so I think it's going to have a hard time getting traction. And there is also this real concern about what would happen if you put ordinary people on juries. I mean, it's not explicitly discussed, but...
Well, that concern comes up in the U.S. a lot.
Sure. But one of the things that's happened with Chinese courts is one of the threats to the growth of the rule of law in the sense of applying rules neutrally and consistently in cases has been pressure from public opinion. So Wang Shengjun, the Supreme People's Court president, has embraced this, but there's a real wariness of it, particularly among legal professionals and legal scholars and such, because one of the pressures that judges will tell you they face in China is pressure from the mob, in effect. So whether it's Weibo, the Chinese Twitter, or various internet storms, or whatever, there's a lot of almost vigilante or mob.
That's a really good point that a lot of people might not realize. Yeah.
So there's a real ambivalence about it, and as judges have sort of struggled to stake out an independent turf for law, if you start having juries come in like that, I think there's some concern about it. Again, it's a very different phenomenon. It shouldn't be the same, but by and large, you just don't have a strong constituency for it.
As I listen to you, I wonder if you agree or disagree with Jerome Cohen, who made a statement when this verdict came out that, well, the Chinese legal system really hasn't changed very much in the last 30 or 35 years. But as I listen to you, you seem to suggest, well, there have been some changes, maybe not all that great, but very incremental ones.
I think it's extremely uneven. I mean, I have a great deal of respect for Jerry. He's a mentor and a friend.
That's what we like on the show, controversy.
But, and I think we're not as far apart as that soundbite might suggest. I certainly had conversations with him over the years that suggest somewhat more optimism. But we do have our disagreements on that. The way I would describe it is that you've got to think of it as a spectrum. And so when you are faced with a high-level, highly political case, like the Gu Kailai case and like what will probably be the Bo Xilai case eventually, that's going to be the area where law is weakest. I mean, it's highly political. The decision goes all the way to the top. No judge is going to take a chance flouting the party line on that. They're going to get pretty clear instructions. That's the most extreme case where you're not going to see much in the way of rule of law. If, on the other hand, you get a commercial case between two evenly matched parties, neither of which is particularly tied to the local government.
My next question, exactly. In a commercial situation, can you get a fair shake in a Chinese court, in a PRC court?
Sometimes yes. And sometimes no. I mean, it really depends. It's so the opposite end of the spectrum is going to be an unpoliticized economic case, commercial case, where neither party is a particular, where the two parties are evenly matched in terms of degree of connection to the state. Things like that. And it also helps to be in a more sophisticated jurisdiction. I mean, to go to a place like Shanghai, there's no company town because there's no one company that dominates. You get a lot of media scrutiny. You have foreign investors there who will scream bloody murder if you expropriate them. And so there are a variety of ways of and you get better quality of lawyers, as well as better quantity of lawyers. And you get judges who, are well trained. They went to the best schools. They have more of a sense of professional competence and role. So is it perfect? No, but it's a rather different point on the spectrum. And there have been reforms within the system that recognize and take account of this. So, for instance, there are specialized intellectual property chambers in courts now to deal with those kinds of cases, which have been a source of much controversy. If you've got a case that is particularly significant economically or that involves a foreign interest, it starts at a higher level court where you get somewhat more experience and, in many cases, more competence.
Let's talk about Zhang Xiaojun. He was the accomplice here. It seems to me he got sort of railroaded into this. Some people call him a family helper. Some papers call him the butler. He apparently is the one who actually procured the poison.
That's the story, yeah.
He got a sentence of 9 years. What was your take on that part of the case?
That was pretty lenient by Chinese standards, I thought. Well, not shockingly so. I mean, his role was clearly that of subordinate and accomplice, but that could have carried a significantly higher penalty. So he got off in some ways relatively lightly. And there's been a lot of discussion. It came out in the statements from the court in China, and certainly in the swarm of analysts that started swirling around it.
Right.
And I think the conventional wisdom here is probably, and the official statements or quasi-official statements are probably on the mark. That is, he did accept responsibility and expressed regret, provided evidence against others. Remember, this web is still unraveling. There are the 4 policemen who engaged in the cover-up. Eventually, there's going to be something about Gu Kailai, although whether it will be about the murder or about something else, we don't know yet. So he got off relatively lightly.
Do you expect his sentence will be reduced?
I don't know that it would be. I mean, I guess it's possible, but I don't see any real pressure to do that. It's toward the low end anyway. Again, the thing with these highly political trials is you got to wait a little while and see how the dust settles. So it's going to, we won't know anything meaningful until after the leadership transition, and even then it may take a few years. It depends on where Gu Kailai's friends and backers wind up among top elite positions in the years to come, about whether there'll be any attempt to revisit it. Now, Gu Kailai herself, if you'll notice, the court and her advocates really did pay a lot of attention to the potential mitigating factors. Right?
And this was the fact that she said she was doing this to protect her son.
There were a few things. There were really sort of 3 pieces to the mitigation argument. One was that she was doing it to protect her son, Bo Guagua, who had been threatened by Neil Haywood, ostensibly. This detention in Britain and a threat which remains very vague. It's not clear how it would have been carried out, but it's an argument. Overlapping with that was the argument that Haywood himself was partially responsible for what happened to him, and that is really the same kind of point. When you threaten somebody, you risk a degree of retaliation. On her side, it was that she was doing it to protect her son, and also that she was perhaps not mentally fully competent, that she had kind of manic depressive type symptoms, that she may not have had clear judgment. Now, there's not a whole lot of attempt to parse the underlying mental illness versus the stress of trying to protect her son, but all these things seem to have been in the mix. The court referred to the partial responsibility of the victim, you get all of these. I think are probably part of the story of why we see a somewhat reduced sentence. But on the other hand, sentencing her to death would have been quite a move. That does not happen to top elite folks. It was a very big deal when a cabinet level minister, head of a ministry, was sentenced to death a couple of years ago. It doesn't reach that level, and this really is essentially, yes, she's the wife of a party secretary, but at that elite level, you just don't see executions. Again, to take the most extreme example, Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, head of the Gang of Four, died in prison. She wasn't executed.
But she committed suicide.
Yeah, but she was not executed.
Allegedly.
Right. I mean, she was not executed at the state, nor were her cohorts. So it just is generally not done at that level.
I'm trying to think. The mayor of Beijing, Chen
Xitong, Chen Liangyi, they were all given lengthy prison sentences.
Okay, and they're both still in prison. Okay. Chen Liangyu, for the benefit of the audience, was the first party secretary of Shanghai until a couple of years ago, where he was summarily removed and is now sitting in a very high security prison just outside of Beijing, the same one that Jiang Qing died in.
He was playing games with the pension fund.
Right.
But again, as with many of these things, it's a part actual misbehavior, corruption in effect, and part politics, supposedly. I mean, he was part of the Shanghai group, which Hu Jintao was trying to edge out, the sort of Jiang Zemin-based former leadership cluster base. So, it's always hard to. There's a sort of a joke I occasionally tell about the level of rule of law in a country that you can measure. If somebody is convicted and thrown in jail, if the view is it is entirely political, then that's a very low level. If it's purely on the merits, it's a very high level, which even we sometimes don't reach. But most places, including China today, are somewhere in the middle. That is, yes, this person almost certainly did something criminal, and probably something significant criminal, but the reason this person was singled out when you're talking about these top leaders has something to do with politics.
I've always heard that Chen Liangyu, he badmouthed Wen Jiabao in a Politburo meeting, and Hu Jintao did not think highly of it.
And Wen Jiabao did not think highly of Bo Xilai either, as we saw.
Yeah, as a matter of
the
fact,
eve
that's
his
a
own-
good
his own
point.
fall. We're coming up on a leadership transition, and that's a time of stress. And you know, one of the issues that people have been watching since Wang Lijun went to the consulate in Chengdu and this whole thing started unraveling is how they're going to handle l'affaire Bo Xilai, the Bo Xilai affair, vis-a-vis the party Congress.
And that's exactly what I want to ask you next. Where do you think where is Bo Xilai going to end up in? Is he going to end up in jail the rest of his life? Is he going to be resurrected?
I mean, for him to have a political comeback, you need a real turn in Chinese politics.
Right.
And they do sometimes happen, but we haven't seen a turn of that magnitude really throughout the reform era.
Deng Xiaoping definitely made a comeback, but there was a turn.
More than one.
Yeah, right, more than one. There definitely was a turn of tide. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think barring some major pivot, his career is over. As far as we can tell, they haven't worked out exactly what they're going to do with him. And this is a real tough choice.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, you could go after him. You could really pound the nails in his coffin and bury that style of politics and his supporters. If you went after him for corruption and for some role in the murder of Neil Haywood and for the killings of various other people with his thuggish police in Chongqing, and really bury him in that sense. The problem is, it generally has not been done. There are lots of people who've done lots of bad things among the top elite, and the question would very quickly become why him and not others, particularly on corruption. I think that's the toughest one.
Well, that's a good one.
Is that if you really go after Bo Xilai for corruption,
Everybody
hates corruption, right? People don't much like murder either, but they understand the symmetry. Everybody hates corruption, but if you go after him for corruption, the question that pops into every halfway well-informed or thoughtful Chinese mind is, but it's not just him. What about all these other cases where you have top-level leaders whose wives and children and cousins and uncles have made lots of money? So who knows what they know. On the other hand, if you go light on him, you can lock him up, right? You can keep him in detention pretty much forever through the party system. There's no real way to spring him. But if you do that, then it kind of looks like you're burying it.
When you say through the party system, I think there's an important distinction here, if I understand you right. You're saying through the Central Disciplinary Committee channels as opposed to the mainstream legal system.
Right. He is. The official statements so far have been mostly about how he has broken party discipline.
Okay.
The system called Shuanggui, the two regulations where you show up and you are essentially under what looks a heck of a lot like incarceration, but it is applicable to party people, not the general mass of Chinese, and there's really very little recourse against it.
I'm glad you mentioned that notion of Shuanggui is something purely for party people who've
breached
gone
party
astray.
rules. Yeah.
And it's my understanding is it's very intensive interrogation.
That is among the things that can happen there. Yeah.
What are some of the other?
Well, I mean, sometimes it is basically detention. You're basically being held without benefit of criminal process. But again, there are many ways of doing that in China. We think of the thing that happened to Gu Kailai, which is a formal judicial process, however truncated, however predictable, that leads to a formal criminal conviction and then a sentence of up to death and whatever term of years short of that. But there is so-called re-education through labor, which is an administrative sanction that is imposed without benefit of trial. And it used to be open-ended, now it's limited to 3 years, and there's some potential for judicial review. There is also protracted detention before trial. There are, in theory, term limits on it, and it doesn't tend to go on forever anymore, but it can keep you in for some number of months before you really get very far into having your day in court, as it were. And there is this party detention process, which is fairly murky. We know something about it, but
a lot of things that are murky.
But people are held for long periods of detention, and it is striking that so far on Bo Xilai, they have talked only about breaches of party discipline. That is the kind of detention he is under. I would be surprised if they don't think it necessary to put him through some criminal process and convict him of some crime. I think it just looks too strange otherwise.
Let's talk about the son here, Bo Guagua. I'm not sure where he is now. Do you know? Do you have any idea?
Where
is he in
He's
China?
been back
is he
and
in
forth.
America? Is he back in Britain?
I actually, last couple of weeks, I haven't been following it as I've been vacationing in your lovely state, where I've been just watering bits and pieces.
Regenerating.
But last I heard, I think he was abroad, not back in China. I don't think he went back. He'd been back once since this whole thing started, I believe. But I think last I heard, I thought he was in the U.S., but I could be wrong about that. It's been a while.
I wonder if the Chinese government is seeking his extradition.
I haven't heard that they have. They would have to charge him with something to seek his extradition, and we generally do not extradite very often to China. I mean, I think it would be a tough one.
You know, that's a really good point. Do we have an extradition treaty with us?
We do not.
I didn't think so.
But we
don't have one with Taiwan either,
right.
which is a nuisance.
Right, but many extraditions happen without treaties. They happen on a case-by-case basis. The treaty just creates a framework and a kind of obligatory process. We've certainly cooperated with Chinese authorities on criminal enforcement before.
Let's do a segue here.
Okay.
It's often said that China can learn much from Taiwan in terms of democracy. Can China learn much from Taiwan in terms of legal procedures, court procedures?
Well, certainly in the sense that there is much room for improvement. Well, probably in all judiciaries, but there's a lot of room for improvement in the Chinese judiciary, and on the whole, the Taiwan judiciary stacks up pretty favorably. I mean, there are problems with it. There are problems of competence. There are problems of corruption.
We're talking about dinosaur judges here.
Some of it's that. Some of it is just, many low-level courts, especially in many places, just are not that good for a variety of reasons. But what's most striking about Taiwan and about courts in Taiwan is, I think, the part that's least transferable to China. That is, there's sort of, I think, two stories about democratic era justice in Taiwan. One is, it's just one of the many pieces of the government that works well as a liberal human rights regarding democracy. I mean, it's, the elections are not perfect. We've used to see fisticuffs in the legislature. We've had some disputed presidential elections, one in particular. We've had, some scandals in the judiciary here and there. But on the whole, it's a fairly impressive system, especially given the baseline it started out at under the late Chiang Kai-shek years. That's sort of the low-grade, day-by-day story. But the really heroic story, in a way, is the story of the Grand Justices, Taiwan's constitutional court, which, in the transition to democracy, handed down opinions which really were a big part of the democratic process. They handed down the decision that said you have to have legislative elections, National Assembly elections, on Taiwan rather than keeping those people elected in 1948 on the mainland.
I thought that was one of the most disgusting aspects of the Kuomintang control of Taiwan.
Right, so guys being wheeled in with the IVs on to.
Yeah.
And that obviously was a significant move toward democracy, and they've grappled with a lot of separation of powers issues. They've grappled with a lot of individual rights issues, and although they have not been really confrontational and sort of doing the sort of Supreme Court against the political branches that you sometimes see in the U.S., they have nudged things fairly significantly. It's certainly expressed strong disapproval and sometimes declaration of unconstitutionality of what the government has done, and the government has accepted that. And so they've not been as radical as they might be in some ways, but they really have been a very significant part of the process of democratization and rule of law in Taiwan. And that is 180 degrees around from the mainland, where the Supreme People's Court, although in many ways, especially under Xia Yang, heroically pushing in its own limited way, there's no way. I mean, there's no constitutional review in China, and we're not going to get there. There's no judicial constitutional review. It rests with the People's Congress.
Aren't you really saying judicial independence?
Well, to some degree. I mean, I think there are a couple of different things. Judicial independence is certainly part of it, and the ability of courts to decide cases on their own without influence is a good deal higher in Taiwan, certainly, than on the mainland. Again, there's that spectrum of cases in the mainland, but the political cases are quite striking. Look what happened to Chen Shui-bian on Taiwan. I mean, that was a sitting president who did all sorts of bad things, and shortly after he left office, faced criminal prosection.
Richard Nixon never ended up in court.
Right, they used to talk about Chen Shui-bian as Taiwan's Nixon, but they meant in terms of rapprochement, perhaps the mainland. The ardent opponent of communism could somehow make peace, but it wound up, yes, he left office under quite a cloud. But that is quite remarkable. Some of it is that the courts can decide free from political interference, and there's a gap. But the other thing is having an institution which not only is independent, but has the authority to interpret the Constitution and to tell the political branches that they may not do something because it's unconstitutional.
Let me ask you a question about the Chen Shui-bian case in just a minute, but another point I just wanted to get your take on. Some people criticize the Taiwan legal system as still carrying fascist-like laws on the books that were created during the 1930s, and in their view, and I would tend to agree with them, should be removed but haven't. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's some cleanup certainly that would be, good to do. We don't really have a situation in Taiwan where there's a lot of use of old laws to oppress people. I mean, it would be nice to get rid of them, but it seems to me that that's, to the extent there are issues, that's not really where it lies.
Okay.
What you have is a court which, even on the constitutional side, has been relatively reluctant to tell the government, the legislature, and the president when they get together that they can't do something. It has to some degree, but it's been moderate, shall we say, in that. I mean, I think that's just not it. The other thing I should say is that in terms of cleaning up bad old stuff on the books in Taiwan, there's always this issue. I think that it shouldn't matter for ordinary legislation and such relatively mundane matters, but if you get near anything constitutional, you start getting into the whole status issue. Are you monkeying with the Constitution in a way that suggests a lack of continuity with the ROC on the mainland? If you do, then you've got the whole cross-strait issue bubbling.
Sometimes the United States itself gets very upset when they talk about possible constitutional change in Taiwan. I understand where you're going. The mainland gets upset, the U.S. gets upset, and Taiwan gets caught in the middle. Probably something should be changed. Would make Taiwan a more efficient running society, a more efficient running government, and they've got to worry about pressure from both sides.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of that. I mean, during the Chen Shui-bian years, that was very much on the table.
Right.
When he proposed this reform to the Constitution,
Yeah.
he was doing all sorts of things which pushed buttons about possible claims of an independent Republic of Taiwan.
Referendums, that kind of
Right.
thing.
So the idea of a referendum, which now is part of the process of constitutional change going forward, that evokes, certainly in the mainland's mind, the notion of a referendum on Taiwan's status,
Right.
which then starts playing this independence referendum, self-determination referendum, all those things we think of in international law as being associated with secession or decolonization or something like that.
Right.
He talked about having there was talk about whether you could touch the territorial and name provisions. He very quickly did not push that, but that was sort of the dream agenda, if you will, for the deep green, the sort of hardcore pro-independence types.
Right.
So anytime you start messing with the Constitution, people start getting upset. And,
Right.
on the U.S. side, we try to steer clear. By we, I mean the U.S. officially, not
US
me.
government.
I certainly don't speak for the government, but try to steer clear of monkeying around in the internal democratic choices of any fellow democracy. On the other hand, and you saw this with the 2008 referendum in Taiwan on entering the UN, where the U.S. said, look, this
US
one
is definitely concerned.
right.
Yeah.
This one is not about Taiwan democracy. It's what it is about is making a point about status and trying to get Taiwan more state-like status, and that puts our foreign policy interests at risk, and therefore we're saying this is not a good idea. But that's rare.
Taiwan has also had, very interesting to me, they've had a lot of, what should we say, public debate about about capital punishment. And as I recall, a former, during Mao's first term, the justice minister resigned over that issue because she was not for capital punishment. She was very strongly against it. And she was really outnumbered by people in the Nationalist Party.
Yeah, it is one of the curious things that if you look around the world, the countries that still have the death penalty, I mean, it's the U.S., it's China, it's several Middle Eastern countries, and Taiwan, Japan. I mean, they're these East Asian democracies, which seem anomalous in that regard.
I believe Korea has it as well.
I think that's right. I think it's common throughout East Asia. Not heavily used, though. I mean, it's one of those things that is, I think, hard to change, but it's just so rarely used that you don't get that much traction. My sense is that yes, of course there are anti-death penalty activists, but it's just not an issue that seems to really gain much traction.
You know, there seems to be this crescendo of espionage cases in Taiwan, and I think it seems that they're getting more and more serious all the time. Is that interesting at all?
Well, it's not
follow
something.
that at all?
It's something I follow terribly closely, but yeah, there have been, of course, several cases of essentially mainland spies and moles, or people who
Recruiting very high level Taiwan officials.
quite high up in the military.
Quite high in the military.
I mean, I think it's almost inevitable. I mean, the commonality, the certain number of people who still have ties across the strait, and there are people who are genuine pro-unificationists. I mean, that's not the mainstream opinion. Obviously, most Taiwanese like the status quo,
right?
But you don't need very many people to be willing to do this to cause a significant problem. And there are, certainly people in any system who may do that. And I think just Taiwan is much more at risk because there is a story people can tell themselves about how China should be united. And they want a peaceful reunification. This is a path in some of their minds, I'm sure, to peaceful reunification. And of course, people have baser interests too, like money and payoffs. And
money is definitely a factor. Now, if you could wave your magic wand over the Taiwan situation, what would your preferable solution be?
Well, if I could wave my magic wand and get my druthers, I mean, I think in many ways the best outcome for Taiwan, I think, would be to have the mainland, give up on the reunification, right? I mean, what you've got is
independence.
De
jure independence.
Right. I mean, yeah.
I thought that's what you were going to say.
Well, but I would not advocate that as a policy because we don't live in that world. We live in a real world, and I think given that, there is a very good reason to hope that the better of the possible outcomes will occur. Which is to say, some gradual progress towards some kind of loose accommodation that keeps Taiwan functionally separate but short of de jure independence. Now, where do we go down that road? I don't know.
Are you saying, in effect, status quo?
Well, status quo, status quo clearly works tolerably well for everybody for the moment. Taiwan safely functions as a separate de facto state-like entity with its own government, its own external relations, its own system, all of that. The mainland can live with it because, and this is one of Hu Jintao's great innovations, to shift from a reunification policy to an anti-secession policy. So as long as Taiwan doesn't say, we're going to declare the Republic of Taiwan, the mainland can live for quite some time patiently with a lack of full reconciliation so long as there's no declaration of independence. Problem is, everybody loves the status quo, but it keeps changing. The problem is that the Chen Shui-bian era obviously had heightened tensions, and that was bad for everybody. It was bad for Taiwan's economy, was bad ultimately for Taiwan's security because it reached a point where it imperiled at least the U.S. zeal for protecting Taiwan's current autonomy. And it got the mainland really ticked off and led to a loss of economic opportunity and a greater risk of political crisis with the mainland. So you backed away from that and you're on the path you're on now with Ma Ying-jeou, which is a rapprochement that follows the strategy of first economics, then politics, first the easy, then the difficult. And that works pretty well. We've been moving forward. The problem is what happens when you get through with the easy and the economic and you have to start talking about the political and the difficult. Then the support for Ma's policies starts to come down. When you start talking sovereignty, the people who are more on the autonomy to independence side get a little squirrely about it. And so I think the road ahead is going to be genuinely tougher than the road the recent past has been. And that's Ma's biggest challenge.
We're down to 1 minute, by the way.
Okay.
And this real fast on the other side, Mr. Su's leadership, do you see him to be the pragmatist that many people say he is?
I think compared to a lot of the other
45 seconds.
Compared to a lot of the other leaders in the DPP, I think that's right. I mean, he's a very able politician. I think the DPP is going to have to go through a generational transition at some point, and he still is a somewhat older generation.
Right.
But he has political skills that Tsai Ing-wen did not, and I think he's more moderate than some of the other leaders. We could talk another time about whether Tsai or Su is ultimately more moderate. I think it's a very complicated story. The mainland painted Tsai.
A very interesting question.
Yeah, the mainland painted Tsai very badly. I think unfairly badly.
Yeah, I think that's true too. Thank you very much for joining us today, right here at the end of your vacation in Hawaii. Hope you have a good flight back to Philadelphia, and hope you come back to Asian Review again.
Thanks you very much. Pleasure being here.
5 seconds under the limit.